Good morning, or afternoon, or whatever time you happen to be watching this. This week I'm going to begin by reading a scripture text before preaching it. This is from John chapter 5. If you would turn there with me, please. John chapter 5. Beginning in verse 1. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 colored colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who he was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. While the title of today's sermon is, "Do You Want to Get Well?" perhaps some people living through our current crisis need to be asked the question, "Do you want to stay well?" Because there are some people who are defying the governor's orders and the orders of other people like the president, but we're in the midst of a 2-week stay-at-home rule, except for those who are doing essential work or have to be at essential places. And so we've been told to not be out in public in order to stop the spread of this terrible coronavirus. There are those who do defy the orders, such as Jerry Falwell Jr. at Liberty University, who says that he's going to be open for classes anyway. And, of course, some of the college students who have already been to spring break. And you may have heard about the rather large congregation in Louisiana where the minister has refused to stop services. There are hundreds of people in attendance at this gathering each week. And this man says that he's not afraid of the virus and that within those gatherings, people have been healed of everything from cancer to AIDS. At least that's what he claims. I would think, though, in my opinion, meeting at a time like this would be like putting God to the test. It's like jumping off the highest point of the temple and expecting the angels to catch you. It's better to listen to the experts, listen to the health authorities who know what they are talking about, and there are ways to meet. We can meet virtually, for example, as we are doing now. We're gathered. It's not the same as in person, but it's a good substitute. Well, in John chapter 5, we find Jesus approaching a paralyzed man in verse 6, and he asks him the question, "Do you want to get well?" And some people might wonder if that's not a bizarre question. I mean, the man's a paralytic. Of course he wants to get well. But it's a legitimate question because some people in this world simply do not want to get well. Deep within the depths of their subconsciousness, they really enjoy their perceived disability. Now, that's not everybody, but there are some people who have come to identify themselves as a victim, and they find their identity in their sickness. And they really, really don't want to get well. And you know who I'm talking about. You can think of someone in your life that you've known like this. You can see them in your mind's eye. You know who they are. Now, I'm not suggesting that the paralyzed man is in this particular category. He might have been someone who sincerely wanted to get well. We simply don't know. We cannot read motives when we are simply reading a narrative about something. We cannot hear voice inflections, we cannot see facial expressions. And so we don't know. This man might have been sincere and obedient to Jesus, or he might have been someone who was an excuse maker and a blamer. We simply don't know, and I've read scholars that go both ways. But whether or not this man wanted to get well, we know that there are some who do not. There are some who don't want to get well, and there are some who are worse off than they think that they are. And they milk their perceived disability for all that it's worth. They like to be waited on. They enjoy the attention. They wouldn't know how to function if they were suddenly thrust into life and had to take responsibility for themselves. Now, don't hear me saying that some people are not truly disabled, because there are those who cannot take care of themselves. There are those who need help. There are those who need around-the-clock attention. And we all, from time to time, need each other. And we're seeing that especially during this coronavirus pandemic, when we're not able to rely upon the goods and services that some of us usually offer. And so we realize our interdependence on one another. But while some could choose to be overcomers, instead they choose to be chronically dependent upon others. The Pool of Bethesda is where Jesus met the paralyzed man. The Pool of Bethesda is just north of Jerusalem, and it's surrounded by 5 porches. And those porches have roofs on them, covers that are suspended by columns. And around this pool, on these porches, it looked kind of like an infirmary. All of these people were lying there, these people on mats, people with their crutches propped up against them. And an apparent superstition was attached to this pool. It was thought that at one time in the past that this pool had been given supernatural properties, and that whenever the waters of the pool bubbled, that the first person in would be healed of whatever infirmary they had. And so when the waters bubbled, there was this mad dash to be the first one in, and the bubbling of the waters were likely caused by underground springs, but there was this tradition that they might have been caused by an angel who had come at some point in the past and troubled the waters in some regard, troubled the waters so as to give them supernatural healing properties. But only the first one in would be healed when the waters bubbled. Some later manuscripts of John include this tradition as if it were fact. It's the 4th verse of the King James Version, which has been omitted in most translations since then. The King James Version relies upon much later manuscripts than those that have been discovered since, and those upon which more recent translations are based. But the oldest manuscripts that we have, dating from the 2nd through the 4th centuries, do not include verse 4 of the King James Version, which only appears in manuscripts from the 8th through 11th centuries. It's likely that the scribes who copied this passage, that some of them added verse 4 as a kind of parenthetical statement to explain why the paralyzed man was hoping to get into the water. And so we have to ask, did an angel really trouble the water? Well, we don't know for sure. But we have to ask, if so, why would an angel do that? And why would he make a contest of it to where only the most agile and the fastest and the most adept could get into the water, and everybody else, well, just, sorry for their luck. And while the tradition doesn't appear in some of the more ancient manuscripts, we do find that Tertullian had knowledge of it in the year AD 200, as well as the preacher John Chrysostom in the 4th century. And I've read that even some pagans associated healing properties with this particular pool. Some of them had dedicated it to the Greek god of healing, Asclepius. And so there were both Jews and Gentiles who believed that this pool had healing properties. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for a Jewish feast, and the first mention of his being there is his trip to this pool where he encounters the paralyzed man. We're not told if this is the first thing that Jesus does in Jerusalem, but it's at least one thing that he does. It's one of the places he visits. And as Matthew Henry observed, Jesus came to the hospitals, not the palaces. And as the more recent New Testament scholar F.D. Bruner has added, Jesus did not go to the places of mass appeal. He went to the places of need. He went where people needed him. Had Jesus gone to the major political figures and the nobility and the priesthood, certainly he could have made a name for himself. He could have become famous. But his ministry was not about drawing accolades to himself. His ministry was about helping others. It was about serving others. And when Jesus spies the man who has now been an invalid for 38 years, he picks out this man in particular, and we're not sure why. It could be because of the length of time that this man has been an invalid. Jesus had special compassion on him. Verse 6 says that Jesus knew how long he had been an invalid. Now, some translations say that Jesus learned it at this point, but actually the Greek says that he knew it, perhaps through some divine intuition. And so Jesus asked him, he says, "Do you want to get well?" And again, it's a legitimate question. The man could simply have said yes, but instead he gives reasons as to why he is not yet well. Could these reasons be excuses, or were they legitimate reasons? We don't know. But the man complains in verse 7, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes ahead of me." And that could actually be true. It's hard for a man who cannot move his legs to compete with those who are faster and can get in the pool sooner. And that could be why Jesus chose this man out of the crowd. Not to say that the pool had supernatural properties, not to say it didn't, but Jesus could see that this man appeared to be left behind. He appeared to be disqualified from hope. Some have speculated that this man could be making excuses. He says, "I have no one to help me," perhaps blaming other people for his predicament. Perhaps there were those willing to help, but there was always some reason perhaps that he would not allow it. Now, we don't know that, but we do know some people who are like that. We know of people who've had every opportunity in life to improve their lot, every opportunity to do better, but they squander every one of them. Person after person has tried to help. These layabouts have had benefactor after benefactor, but one by one, they've been frustrated and driven away. People who choose chronic dependence manage to burn a lot of bridges. Some might blame circumstances on why they cannot improve their lot in life, or as to why it has not been improved already. Some might say, "Everyone else is going ahead of me. The system is rigged." The unfairness of this world becomes an excuse for lack of progress. Some might go through life blaming other people or circumstances. Criminals claim to be victims of a failed society. Backsliders claim to be victims of a church that failed them. Addicts claim to be victims of dysfunctional families or genetics. Adulterers claim to be victims of a negligent spouse. And while some or all of these things may be true, there is no excuse for not moving on and taking responsibility for yourself. But some will come back with, "It's just the way I am," or "I cannot help it," or "I was born this way." And to those people the question might be posed, do you want to get well? Do you want to improve your lot? Some people, deep down in their subconsciousness, they really don't want to get well. They spend their lives waiting for someone else to come along and take care of them, and that person never shows up. When Jesus healed people, he did not then micromanage their lives, but he ushered them in to a new life of blessing and also of new responsibility. Some people try to shirk responsibility. I've known people who've said that they cannot work a physical labor job because at the end of the day their back hurts or their feet hurt. Or they can't look at a computer screen all day because their eyes hurt. And in the beginning, yes, that's the way it's going to be. Some people do have genuine disabilities, but there's going to be some pain before there's any gain. I remember when I was 19 years old, I took a job mopping floors all day long. And at the end of the day, my back and feet hurt so badly because I wasn't accustomed to that kind of physical labor. But over time, it got easier. it got a lot easier, and before long I wasn't in any pain at all. And so no pain, no gain. Some of us have to push through the pain in order to work hard to get ahead. And it takes a great deal of work to achieve financial wellness. Some just aren't willing to do it. Some would just rather depend upon enabling parents or grown children or the government, someone else to take care of them. But fiscal responsibility means discipline. It means learning how to save. It means that you stop impulse buying. It means that you stop buying non-essentials until you can dig yourself out of this hole. Some people don't want to get well physically. They love the attention. Being sick, as I said, becomes their identity. And I know people who are genuinely sick, but there are some who are not as sick as they need to be. They never exercise. They eat nothing but processed junk. They have unhealthy habits. And if you really want to get well, then you've got to make some changes. You've got to take some responsibility. And whether the man at the pool had failed in this, we do not know. Had he been at the pool 38 years and had found no one to help him, then certainly that might have been an excuse, because in 38 years you could certainly find someone. But we're not told that he had been at the pool for 38 years. We're only told that he had been an invalid for 38 years. Nor are we told whether he was born in this condition or whether it was something that happened to him later on in life. But we do know that Jesus told him to pick up his mat, and the man does it. He doesn't argue, and for some reason he thinks that he can do it. He makes the effort, and somehow at this point, after nearly 40 years, the signal from his brain, his feet and his legs respond to that, and he gets up and he walks. Jesus achieves what the troubled waters could not achieve, could not accomplish. Jesus achieves what the Greek god Asclepius could not accomplish. Jesus achieves what no man can accomplish by lowering someone down into the pool. But Jesus heals this man instantly. Verse 9 goes on to tell us that the day this took place was a Sabbath. And so the guy is walking around with his bedroll, and he is stopped by some Jewish religious leaders, no doubt, and they tell him that the Sabbath forbids him to carry his mat. And they go on to ask him who told him that he could. And now you would think that these guys would be blown away by the fact that an invalid had been healed. And this guy's paralysis, it was not hidden from anyone. This is a man who had to beg for a living, and after 38 years, everyone would have recognized him. They would have known who he was because he stood out in society. But these guys are such bean counters that all they can think of is the strict letter of the law. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And it's true that carrying burdens were forbidden on the Sabbath, but in Jeremiah 17:21 and 22, the instruction goes that no burdens are to be carried in terms of commercial enterprises. The gates of Jerusalem were not to be open to merchants. They were not to be open to merchants on the Sabbath, nor were farmers to be loading their grain and moving it from one place to another, nor were people to be taking items outside of their house. And so the Sabbath is a lousy time to begin spring cleaning or to start cleaning out your garage. Nehemiah was upset to see people treading their winepress on the Sabbath, bringing goods into Jerusalem and selling food, Nehemiah 13, verse 15. But to simply carry a mat from point A to point B was not likely that big a deal. And the Jews had always made exceptions for things like rescuing people or animals from harm, giving medical attention. These exceptions were always made on the Sabbath, and they are to this day. The idea was to cease productivity, to realize that God is in control and you can trust Him. You don't have to work yourself to death. But traditions had built up over the years. Traditions had built up, and religious leaders sought to build hedges around the law. They built these hedges around the law, laying layers of rules upon rules to keep people from getting too close to transgressing the boundary. And these Jews passed down these laws orally. They were later eventually collected in a book known as the Mishnah by the 2nd century. It's not that Jesus ever really broke the Sabbath by putting people first, for that is what the Sabbath is all about. It's about the needs of people. It's about putting people first. That's its real intent. But he broke the rules of the scribes and Pharisees and of the rabbis regarding the Sabbath. He also demonstrated the Sabbath's true intent and its built-in flexibility. The failure to acknowledge a miraculous healing by getting hung up on what day it occurred is really silly. The leaders strained out a gnat in their meticulous efforts to build hedges around the Sabbath, but they swallowed a camel in regard to their failure to see when human need was being met. The failure to acknowledge the miraculous healing by getting hung up on the day of the week means that they could not see the good news because they were too busy policing religious ordinances. And as many of the prophets have said to us, people come first. The needs of people come before religious ordinances. Now, I used to explain this by saying that people come before worship. But if you define worship more broadly as it is in the Bible, defining all of our humble submission to God in all that we do, then if you don't have worship, you really don't have anything. But this is a lesson on the weightier matters, in which the needs of the paralytic came before the strictest Sabbath observance. And we can see in our own lives today where our commitment together every first day of the week has been overridden by the higher command of loving our neighbors as ourselves. We don't want to go and spread germs with them. We don't want to be people who spread this epidemic around. And so sometimes you've got to look to the higher commandment. You've got to look at what's most important. And these Jewish leaders, they didn't get that. They thought that everything was of equal importance. And as opposed to praising Jesus for his miraculous healing, they wanted to know just who gave this man permission to carry his mat. He didn't manage to get Jesus' name. He didn't know who this guy was. Now, whether that's a reason for criticism, I do not know. But this guy had no idea who Jesus was. And in verse 14, Jesus finds him in the temple, which is a very good place to be. And he says to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." Now, what sin is Jesus telling this man to stop? Some have speculated that he is telling this man to stop making excuses, to stop blaming other people, and start taking responsibility. Now, we don't know for sure that this man failed in any of those things. We don't know. It's speculation. Others speculate that Jesus apparently sees a link between this man's sin and his former paralysis, as if God had been punishing him for some sin. We don't know that either. The text does not say that. So to what sin did Jesus refer when he tells the man to stop sinning? Well, the paralytic knew. He knew what his sins were. He knew of the sins of which he was guilty. And if Jesus said to you directly, "Stop sinning," would you know what he was talking about? Of course you would. Because we are all painfully aware of our shortcomings. We are painfully aware of our transgressions, painfully aware of our sins. And we know we need to stop sinning, and we know what those things are that we need to stop doing. I think that Jesus was telling the man to stop sinning in general. He was basically saying to the man, you need to come to repentance. It's like Jesus was saying, okay, you've been physically healed, now it's time to be spiritually healed. It's time to give your life to God by putting your trust in me. And if you don't, something worse may happen to you. But how can anything be worse than being a paraplegic? Citing scholar Gary Burge, F.D. Bruner lists some of the challenges that people have who are paraplegics. There are problems of mobility, livelihood, social isolation, and personal hygiene, since paraplegics frequently do not have bowel or bladder control. Can you imagine What an outcast this paralytic must have been. People would not have wanted to be around him. And so Jesus comes along and he asks, do you want to get well? And he later tells him, stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you. Now, what could be worse than paralysis? As Matthew Henry said, the poolside hospital might have been a melancholy place, but hell is much more so. So you think you've had a rough life. You think you've had challenges. You think you've had it difficult. But if you don't stop sinning, something worse may happen to you in this life, and something worse will happen to you in the next. And maybe Jesus has given you a new life, but have you lived as a new person? Have you lived in gratitude for the grace received, for the gift that he has given you? And while you're still drawing breath, it is not too late to come to him. Now, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, this particular text was used to prepare candidates for baptism. And it's not about baptism per se, but the water in this text was at least thought to have some transformative properties. Chrysostom drew the analogy that the waters of the pool, like baptism, need the Spirit's stirring in order to be effective. While we don't know if there was really any supernatural connection to the pool, we do know what Jesus said to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, verses 3 through 5. We're born again. Being born again is synonymous with being born of water and of the Spirit. And if you have not yet been born again, I urge you to consider it and to contact me if you have any questions. Whatever spiritual, financial, emotional, relational, or physical troubles you may have, you don't have to walk through them alone. Jesus will be there for you. And if you desire spiritual wellness, Jesus is your only hope.